My name is Gaia, also known as Athena. In this video I would like to talk about some of the books I've read recently. This includes all my library loans, as well as a couple of my own books. This is probably going to be a long video, because I have a lot of books to talk about. I will try to not take too long per book though. In the future, I plan to make the review videos shorter and discuss less books in them, rather than so many like now. But the thing is, my library loans have to be handed in soon, so I only really have today to make this video. Well, with all that said, I hope you enjoy this video. There will be some Dutch books and some English books. Enjoy! So the first book of my library loans that I read in July actually was Plan C by Simone. This book is about a girl whose parents decide to adopt another child, but then it turns out the child that will be her brother is actually older than her, and he is not like she imagined. He doesn't actually want to be there, for example. He would rather have stayed in his previous situation. I liked this book. It was nice. Yeah, it was enjoyable. It's been a few weeks since I read this book, so I can't quite remember so much of it, but it was a nice read. You won't really miss anything if you don't read it. It's Dutch, but yeah. Then the next book I read was Krabbels van by Simone. To be honest, I don't quite remember a whole lot of thing about this book now a few weeks later. This is a book about a girl who lives with her father. A mother passed away, I want to say a year ago, and her father is not really properly taking care of her, and this really bothers her. I liked this book at the time, but I can't really remember a whole lot about it now a few weeks later, so it was enjoyable but also a little bit forgettable apparently. Then the next two books I read were Sterren and Applaus for Sterren, which are both part of the same series. So first comes this book, then comes this book. They're written by Simone. I didn't really enjoy these two books, to be honest. I found the main character really unlikable. She made questionable decisions. She was jealous. Oh, and I should tell you what it is about first. These books are about a girl who loves to sing, and in this book, the first book, she wants to have the main lead role in the school musical, but then her best friend gets the lead, and she is very jealous of her best friend for this. And well, I won't say the synopsis of this book because it might spoil it a bit if I do, but yeah, I didn't get on with these much. I didn't like the main character. In this book she has some trouble with school, and I felt like she wasn't really trying her best, and so yeah, these two were unfortunately not for me. Then I read Zora and Mira by Anja Coquyt, with illustrations by Pieter. This book is about a girl on the autism spectrum and a little robot. Her neighbor has a robot, and she and the robot strike up a friendship. The robot is named Zora and the girl is named Mira. I personally quite like this book. I'm thinking if you don't have autism it might be of a little bit less interest to you, but I enjoyed it. It has a few funny bits and it was endearing. The illustrations were nice. I liked it. The next book I read was Laatste, Zwaard by Thea and Geronimo Stilton. This is the fourth and final book in the 13 Zwaarden series, or in English I think it might be called the 13 Swords. I was a little bit disappointed with this book, to be honest. I read the first three books in the series and really liked them, but I was expecting a little bit more of an epic battle scene, final scenes with this, and it was a bit too similar to the others, which I suppose is what I should have expected, but I was a little bit disappointed with this one versus the other ones, but it was still an okay read. Next up I read Reis, naar Høge by Mathilda and Georgien Overwater. This book is book 3 in the Keukenprins van Mocano series. In this book, Max, Tredici and Coquyt are travelling north to resolve a situation there. This book was quite funny. It had a lot of nice illustrations and I really enjoyed it. I quite liked the first 2 books in the series as well. The next book I read was Odeline and the Purple Fox by Chris Riddell. So this one's in English. I previously read 2 other books in this series. This is book 4 in the Odeline series. I think I read books 2 and 3. I didn't enjoy this one as much as I remember I liked the other 2 books. I found there wasn't as much of a plot in this one. I didn't quite enjoy it as much. I did really like the drawings, but it is also a bit of a forgettable read for me, this one. Then I read Merel Jansen en het einde der tijden by Will Mabbitt. Illustrations by Ross Collins. In English this book is called Mabel Jones in the Doomsday Book. I quite liked the first 2 books in this series that I read a while ago, but unfortunately this 3rd book didn't really work for me. The thing is, I couldn't remember much of what happened in the previous 2 books, and I couldn't remember the characters, so a lot of the people we meet in this book, I could not remember them, and there wasn't as much of an explanation who they were or anything like that. I think possibly I would have enjoyed it more had I read the books closer together. But I just didn't really feel it for this book, and to be honest I skimmed the last bit and I can't really remember much of it right now. The next book I read was Amelia Fang and the Barbaric Ball. This is book 1 in the Amelia Fang series. Or at least I'm assuming that's what it's called, because I couldn't really find this anywhere. This is written by Laura Ellen Anderson. This is again a book in English, and I really enjoyed this one. This book is about a vampire girl and her friends who meet this annoying prince. Now the plot sounds kind of standard, but it actually took it into a direction I wasn't expecting. I really liked the illustrations. It was nice, with a sort of like kind of darkish horror vibe, and I quite liked this book. It was one of the highlights of my library loans. Now we've made it into the reads of August, and the first book I read in August was Wilde Haren by Elsje Bakker. This is a short comic about a girl who is a hairdresser, but she gets fired from her job, and so she tries to start her own business. This was pretty short, but I did like it. It's not something I'm gonna really remember down the line, but the twist at the end was something I quite liked. Next up I read The Adventures of John Blake, Mystery of the Ghost Ship by Philip Pullman and Fred Fordham. I don't actually know if this graphic novel is based on an actual novel by Philip Pullman or not. This story is about... It's a little bit difficult to explain what this book is about. It's about a time-traveling ship and people trying to get to the ship to steal the invention for nefarious purposes. I thought this book was alright. I liked it. It was interesting, but a few times I was a bit confused as to which character was who, because there were quite a lot of people you see in the pictures. Next up I read Famous Deluxe Book 1, or Book 1, which is a bind-up of, I want to say, the first 10 comics, I think. And this is written by a bunch of people. Bill Willingham, Lon Medina, Mark Buckingham, Steve Leialoha and Craig Hamilton. And this bind-up basically has 2 times 5 comics, so kind of 2 separate stories. And they involve characters from fables. I thought it was really nice to see these different fairy tale characters and also animals. I liked both storylines. I didn't love this book, but I liked it, so it was a nice read. Then I read Marzi, 1984 to 1987. This is the Dutch version, and this was written by Sylvain Savoya and Martina Soa. It's a memoir of Marty, and her years of living in Poland as a young girl. This was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. I thought this book was quite interesting. I quite liked learning about what her life was like back then as a child, and what happened and what things from their culture and how that affected her and all these kinds of things. There wasn't a lot of dialogue in the pictures. Most of the text was the author narrating the pictures, but I quite like this book. Next up, I took a bit of a break from my library loans because every month I have a readathon with some of my friends. During this readathon, which is 3 or 4 days, we try to read a little bit more than we usually do. We don't have a set theme because my friends and I like to read somewhat different kinds of books in some occasions, so everyone is just reading what they like to read. For me, it works well to read shorter books during readathons, as well as graphic works, and so this year I've been starting a few manga series, and I'm reading 1 volume of that every month. So I'm going to tell you of some of my own books now that I read during this readathon, and then we'll go back to the rest of the library loans. So the first book I read for this readathon is Princess Jellyfish Volume 6 by Akiko Higashimura. This volume 6 is the English bind-up of 2 Japanese volumes, namely volumes 11 and 12. This series is about a group of girls, or women. They live in the same house, there's 5 of them, and they each have their own special interests that they're very nerdy about. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil what happens in this series. I quite enjoyed the series so far, and I really enjoyed reading volume 6. The next book I read was actually a reread, and this is With the Light, volume 6 by Keiko Tobe. This series is about a mother raising an autistic child. The child is quite heavily autistic, and he can speak a bit, but not very well. She also has another daughter and a husband, and we follow the adventures of this family, but mostly of the mother and the boy. I quite liked rereading this 6th volume. Also, this 6th volume is a bind-up of, I think, 2 original Japanese volumes, but yeah, something like that. Next up, I read Chobits Volume 3 by Clamp. This series is about a boy and an android. I saw the anime adaptation, but I hadn't read the manga before, so this year I'm reading the manga. The TV adaptation follows the books pretty closely, so I already know a lot of what's happening. I enjoyed reading this 3rd volume. Then I read Fashion Academy Book 3, Punk Meets Preppy. This book is written by Simone Arts and illustrated by Tante Bön. This series is about a fashion academy, and each book follows a boy and a girl who are attending the academy. I quite liked this book, it was enjoyable. Then I read An Age of License by Lucy Nisley. This is a graphic memoir in which Lucy Nisley travels to several different countries in Europe. I quite enjoyed reading this book. Some parts were more interesting than others, but I guess that makes sense. I thought the illustrations were quite nice. Then I read Ik wil lekker vies by Tony Ross. This is part of the My Little Princess series, and in English this book is called I Don't Want to Wash My Hands. This book was okay. It was nothing special for me. I think it's good that there are books like this out there for young children, but I personally didn't get a lot out of it. Then I read Alles uit de kast by Marjolein Hund and Jan-Paul Schutte. This book is basically a book that tells children about how books are being made, how they're being published, how is a book put together. It had nice illustrations and the information was good for children, and I thought it was nice. The last book I read of my own books for this readathon was The BFG by Roald Dahl. This was a reread for me because I wanted to see the recent 2016 Steven Spielberg adaptation of this book. But I first wanted to read the book and then see the movie. This is actually the Dutch cover, but I watched the film with English voices because I much prefer this. I enjoyed rereading the BFG. It was a nice story. It was also nostalgic for me to read it again. And I liked the adaptations, but a few things were different in the book, and sometimes this bothered me. Now I'm going back to my library loans, and the first library loan I read after that was Vie, Het geheim van de poollicht by Petra Jongeneel. This is an illustrated book which is about some sort of fantasy world. It's kind of difficult to explain, and I liked it, but I also was expecting a little bit more of it. I wasn't able to find a whole lot of information about this book, but I think this might be the first book in a series. Next up I read Wet Rabbit by Lissa Evans. I really liked this book. This book is about a girl whose younger sister gets into an accident. and her, the little sister's, stuffed animal rabbit comes to life. I don't want to say too much about what happens in this book because that would be spoiling it. However, I thought this book was really good. It was magical and it was one of the highlights of my library allowance. Next up, I read this memoir, Gelukkig, ik ben gewoon artiest, by Ferry-Jan Jonker. This is a memoir written by a man who found out he had autism when he was just over 80 years old. In the book, he says there isn't a lot of attention for autism for the elderly, and I had never really thought about this, and I was therefore quite glad to read this book and to read more about how it could affect you at a late age and what it was like for him to discover he had autism that late in his life. I also really enjoyed how he talked about his marriage with his wife, who unfortunately passed away a few years before he wrote this book and before he found out he had autism. I enjoyed reading this book, but I didn't recognize myself in everything. There were some paragraphs I couldn't identify much with, or that I found less interesting to read. Some things were really interesting, so it was a nice read. Next up, I read The Jungle van Autisme by Beersen Bazaar, and this book is about a Turkish woman with autism who lives in the Netherlands, and it's about how Turkish culture looks at autism and how she experiences her autism. And I found this book quite interesting because I didn't really know much about Turkish culture and how they look at autism and what it is like to live in the Netherlands as a Turkish person. And I thought this book was quite interesting. I liked it. Next up, I read Iris Grace by Bella Carter Johnson with illustrations from Alice Tate. This is the Dutch translation of the book, and this is written by the mother of an autistic girl, Iris Grace, and she seems to be more of on the less functioning side of the spectrum. She doesn't speak much, and I quite enjoyed reading how the mother teaches her things and educates her and really sees what works for the girl and what doesn't. Furthermore, it included lots of photos of Iris Grace, and the story also involves a cat and art, and all of the pictures were beautiful. I love the art, and yeah, I really like this book. Next up, I read Autisme in Bolletjes by Peggy Royakkers. This book is about the difference between the brains of autistic people and the brains of non-autistic people, or neurobrains is what the author calls them in this book. This book was interesting, however I can't remember as much now as I did just after I finished it, which is a bit unfortunate. But it had some interesting points. The next three books are all part of the same series, and that is the Spy School series. So I read Evil Spy School, Spy Ski School, and Spy School Secret Service. And these books are books 3, 4, and 5 in the Spy School series, and it's written by Stuart Gibbs. I would love to read the first 2 books in the series sometime, because I really enjoyed these 3 books. The series is about a teenage boy who is, or who at least in these later books, is a student at the spy school, and the books are very thrilling, very suspenseful. He gets put on like a mission, and I thought they were quite good. There were surprising plot twists. I will say that having read them in a row, you can see certain similarities between the books. I did really appreciate though that they recap some of the things that happened in earlier books, so I really appreciated that. I quite liked these books. I have 2 more books to show you, and they are 2 books that I learned from the library but that I didn't actually finish reading. The first one is Mijn ouders maken me gek by Pete Johnson. This is part of the Louis de Love series, and the English title is My Parents Are Driving Me Crazy. This book seems to be about a boy who gets into some trouble with his parents, but I read a couple of pages and I just wasn't really feeling it. I wasn't in the mood for this type of book, so I put it aside. The last book is a book that I flicked through that I decided I didn't have enough time to read before it was due, but that I liked a lot of what I flicked through, so I decided to buy my own copy. This is the library copy, and the book is Autisme, de vele gezichten van een stoornis, by John Donovan and Karen Zucker. And in English this book is called In a Different Key, and I bought myself my own copy because I liked this book, the look of it, so much. This book is about the history of autism, and I look forward to reading it when I have my own copy. Well, that was probably a long video. I hope you enjoyed listening to all of that. In the future, these videos will be shorter, and I will be discussing more English books, but you'll have to stay tuned for that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Bye!